Hi, and welcome back to Continual. We're here to talk about, as we grace upon the stories of fantasy and fae, we're here to talk a little bit about romantasy. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and so before we start getting into all sorts of love and death between creatures alive and divine, let's go around and see who is coming forth to bring forth their own little pieces of the folklore. So, Jamie, you're up first.
Hey, I'm Jamie Garner. I am a official author and editor. I write as Jamie Garner, Amelia Quantrill, and Temple Heart, and Romance plus Fantasy. Sign me up, sailor.
Susan?
I'm Susan Griffith. I'm one half of the writing team of Clay and Susan Griffith. We've written historical fantasy. You could probably call our Vampire Empire series romantasy in some ways. I love a romance. I love a good fantasy. You can't beat it, so I'm always in.
Kyoko?
Hi, everybody. I am Kyoko M. I'm the author of the Black Parade Urban Fantasy series and the Of Cinder and Bone science fiction series. I'm also a contributor to Black Panther Tales of Wakanda and Captain America, The Shield of Sam Wilson, which will be out in February. And I am one of the misfits in the cobbled together little found family that we have over at Falstaff Books. I have a new book out that came out this past October called The Starlight Contingency. As far as romantasy goes for me, it is definitely my bread and butter. That is where my debut series was romantasy, so I absolutely love it. I'd love to talk about it with these talented people here and with anybody in general.
Melissa?
Hey, I'm Melissa Olthoff. I write sci-fi and fantasy, and I used to say I sneak in romance wherever I can, but now I just throw it in there, and it's just bold and because, oh my God, I love a strong romantic subplot in my adventure. So I am happy to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics.
So this notion of romantasy, we've seen, I think, is kind of come shaped over the last few years. We've seen a lot of romantic elements in fantasy, dark fantasy, all the good stuff. So this is nothing new, but I think that it is sort of creating its own subgenre within the space. And I think that's the first thing is really how do we describe it? Because I don't think we've gotten fully to what is or is not the subgenre. Where does it cross those lines? So I kind of want to start there before we start diving into how do we craft it, what makes for a good element for it. Let's talk about what it is to start with from you guys' perspectives. So, Jamie, what about you? How do you define romantasy?
Well, I define romantasy myself, and it's something that has been around for a long time, as you said, in a lot of ways, shapes, and forms. For me specifically, though, I look for something where we often have romance as a subplot in a lot of different genre fiction, fantasy included. I think romantic fantasy, is where the romance claws its way up from being a subplot to being either one of the main plots or the main plot, while still retaining all the genre fantastical elements that mark a proper fantasy book. If you don't have enough romance, it's not romantasy. If you have two, then it's just fantasy for romantic subplot, and
Susan?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a blending, but that blend has to have a little bit more urgency, agency within that story. So, I mean, there's plenty of books that will have a fantasy element. I mean, but it's also going to be more female centric, however that comes into play. It also needs to just make sure that, it takes the foreground, that those elements are not just, in there for no purpose other than sorry, you want that to carry the story around. They just happen to be in a fantastical place. I mean, that's what the old Harlequins were. If you think back to old romance or any of the romance books, I mean, it was a romance book, but it was a pirate book. It was a romance book, but they're in World War II. Or if it's a romance book, we're in the Wild West. It doesn't make the setting is fantasy, but the main core of it has to be the romance and the characters and how they make you feel, to really give it that romantasy element.
Kyoko?
I was really excited when I first heard this term. So I was a little bit late in the game. I didn't really start hearing the term romantasy used until about like early last year-ish for me in particular. And so as I was kind of learning about what counts as romantasy, it made a lot more sense to me for them to kind of start using that in lieu of the more umbrella term was paranormal romance for the most part. And because a lot of the times they really wanted to focus the paranormal romance on only things that have to do with, like I said, ghosts, angels, demons, things like that. I like the romantasy umbrella because I think it's a little bit more inclusive, and I think it's just slightly more clear about what that blend is. I think Jamie made a great point about I consider it to be something just like that, where it's kind of half and half. So whether or not usually the romance is factoring back into things other than just character. It can sometimes affect the plot or not, but it could also just be the person's character arc. And that's why I really like the title, because you think of things like where the romance is really important and it actually does factor into the plot and does both. So some people would argue it's sci-fi fantasy, but The Fifth Element is an example I would use of like, no, the romance actually is important, not only to the plot, but to the actual characters itself. And so that's kind of how I define it, is like when it's usually it's affecting the characters and the plot. It's doing both. And then the difference between something that has romance in it is when the romance is still not a full B plot, if that makes sense, where it's not fully integrated and running parallel to another storyline. I think that would be the difference between a romantasy and a fantasy that just happens to have a romance in it.
Melissa?
Well, I think they kind of all nailed it on the head there, but for me, like they've said, it's where the romance and the fantasy are both integral to the plot, where you have those elements where, yes, their relationship, usually a female main character, usually first person, though not always, and her relationship with, the love interest is a plot driver, where what happens with them affects what's happening to your main character in the story. And a lot of the romantasies lately, start going all the way back to ACOTAR, like they're epic in scope. They're not cozies usually. They're very much like the world is at stake, or her life is at stake, or, their kingdom, or just that epic scope to it makes everything much more vibrant and real, and just that urgency of, well, will they, won't they? It's not just the angst and the buildup. It's this really kind of affects like what's going to happen with this story. I love that part.
So Susan, I'm going to come to you for this.
Okay.
So looking at these notions of romantasy and looking at setting up the story, how do you decide to approach it? Do you come up with the setting, the world, and everything you're trying to set up? Or are you looking at the characters, the story, and everything first? And how do you make sure that that's the right setting that ties in for that particular romantasy?
I mean, for me, characters always first, no matter whether I'm writing romantasy, whether I'm writing historical fantasy. It doesn't make a difference. To me, I'm always coming from the idea comes from the characters. And then when you're writing with a partner, like I do with Clay occasionally, he's got the world building, I've got the character. So we'll talk about a setting or a concept, and my brain's already firing for character and how those characters are going to play into that storyline. And as much as he tolerates it, I want the romance, so I'm always putting in the romance, even if he's rolling his eyes at it. But when I'm writing my own stuff, it's always character centric, always romance centric. The plot is important, and you can't say that it isn't. And because those characters have got to be moving along in that storyline, and you've got to have a good plot. But to me, if those characters aren't engaging, if those characters aren't really capturing the heat that that needs to generate in order to keep the readers engaged in what they're going to be doing, whether or however they're going to be romancing, then the setting is almost second, and it's not really going to help the storyline. So to me, it's always, if I can't find those two characters to find that connection, that heat, the settings in the storyline is not going to help. So to me, I come from there first. I definitely want a good story, though. They're on an adventure. We need to have them on a good adventure. So that will always be into play, but character first for me.
Kyoko?
I think I'm definitely a very character-centric person when I put things together, and it really does kind of sort of depend on the work itself. Oh no, did I just... Okay.
You're here.
You're still there.
Oh, okay. Sorry, my interface absolutely freaked out.
No.
I'm so sorry.
You're okay now.
Okay, good.
fine.
I'll just keep going.
Keep
Keep
going.
going. You're good.
Oh,
You're good.
as you went. Okay, got it. All right. I'm a very character-centric person. Most of the time, the romance is already in my head before I even put it down on paper. As a matter of fact, the of Cinder and Bone series came from two things. One of them was just a concept that I had thought was interesting, but literally I had a dream in which Jack, Kamala, and Faye were asleep in bed together, and it was just this really striking image of a polyamorous relationship in my head, and I was like, I don't know why, but I feel very passionate about this and I want to write about it, and so I did. And so, like I said, most of my stories are going to be crafted with that romance in there because I just like to write it. It's just what I do at all times. I write mountains of fan fiction because I think it's fun to just fall in love over and over and over again with the same or different characters. Because it breeds so many interesting conversations. It can have different effects on the characters, and it can affect their arc. It can affect their environment. It can affect so many different things. So I think most of the time I do kind of start even before words are on the page. The relationships and how those are going to develop and change are always really, really why I love to write. I'm a banter person. I've always been a banter person. I was just raised on it. And also my freaking parents are a prime example of that. I have two parents who affectionately roast the hell out of each other. All the time. And I have a family that's like that too. I have a very witty family. It is just, we are always constantly making fun of each other and just being silly and things like that. So yes, I would say that I almost always start mine with that romance in the forefront, and it's usually something I know going in that's what I want to focus on, and I kind of build it out from those particular relationships.
Melissa?
I have found my people. This is amazing. Could not agree more. I always build from character first. Usually I will get a voice in my head and go, oh, there you are. That's my main character. And then I will build out from there. And usually the next voice I find will be the love interest, because, man, I love that romance. I love it not just because it's fun, not just because of the buildup and the angst and the tension and all the things that we love about romance. But to me, it makes everything feel more real. I write everything from urban fantasy to military science fiction, and having characters have those relationships and starting new relationships just makes them feel more real. It makes the story have more depth to it, regardless of what kind of setting you're in, whether it's an urban fantasy, whether it's a romantasy where you're talking about epic fantasy and kingdoms and all that cool stuff with dragons and magic. Love it. Or, science fiction where you're talking spaceships and space battles. It's the scene I'm knee deep in right now. It's fine. But that romantic element, though, man, it drives every story I write, and I love it so much. Also, banter. 100%. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Jamie?
To almost do pretty much a clean sweep, characters kind of have to come first. It's especially in a romance. When you're thinking romantasy, that romance has to be at least the equivalent of your main plot, if not, and I prefer deeply entwined. So the romance itself is a plot element, therefore it must be given all the attention of a plot element, and romance is founded on characters. So if you don't have characters, you don't have romance, you don't have your plot, you may as well just give up. I'm sure there is a romantasy writer out there that is a plot-first writer. I don't know who they are. I think they probably need to be enshrined and protected in a museum. before their species dies out. But I think it's just very hard to do. I think it's very hard to approach romance any other way than here are our romantic leads, whatever number their needs must be, and then it is their bouncing off each other, the bonds they form, the breaks, the twists and turns that make the story. So, now one thing I will say is, as a kind of an aside, though, I think it's very important because you are dealing with romantasy is, again, it's a lot of fantasy. I think it's very important to have those fantastical elements in mind, even if the plot isn't formed when you're doing the characters and the romance, because this is a pet peeve. I really dislike any kind of romantasy or any other romance add your genre fiction. Like it comes out in February. I've got a superhero romance that's basically a romantasy, but in modern days with superheroes and villains. So I don't know what portmanteau we can do for that, but it's the same principle, right?
Yes.
When you have a strong genre fiction, even if the romance is first, you need to have those genre elements. Because the one pet peeve I have is when you have a romance with strong genre elements and the characters don't, and that doesn't factor into their romance.
Yep.
It's you could cut the romance out and put it in modern times and it'd be the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't ping pong right. It doesn't warm my jigglies or whatever you want to call it.
Well, and that kind of goes to the next question I wanted to dive into, because with a romantasy, if you can pull the romance out, you don't have one, right? If you can pull the romance out and the story still stands, you don't have a romance, right? At best, you have a subplot. And often, if you can just pull the romance out, then you got other problems too, right? So, but at the same time, if you're really going in, those romantic elements, even in the biggest, most epic story, whether it is, I'm going across the great slopes and chasing whatever it is I may be chasing. I've got dragon romance. I've got whatever else, all the, as they like to call it at Dragon Con, boinking beasties. If you've got all of these moving pieces here, but you don't have what to me is one of the most core human elements, which is that notion of romance, right? If it's those human relationships that form, if you lose sight of those kinds of connections that form over time, then you don't have a full, well-rounded story. Mm-hmm. And I suck at writing romance, let's be honest. But even with that, you still have to have that. Don't say you have to, but I mean, in romantasy, that is a core element to it, is creating and crafting the relationships in there. So, Kyoko, how does the nature of working in fantastical worlds change how the romances work?
It often, to me, it puts them in situations where they may not have even been looking for romance, and it comes across their plate, and it kind of changes their perception of what they thought of themselves. I think it can be a part of their identity in a way. That's when done correctly, it can be. I think it can be really appealing, in that way. Sorry, just give me the question again. I felt like I didn't answer that right.
How does the notion of being in fantastical worlds change the romance? Much like Jamie was just talking about, right? It's got to be the right romance to the right plot and to the right world. And if you're in a fantastical setting, the romance that'll work in downtown New York is not going to necessarily work in downtown insert your fantastical world here. You have different culture, you have different stresses, especially if you're in something that's a bit more of an epic fantasy type of setting where you're in life or death. It's also not necessarily going to look like your standard, thriller romance. So what is it about the romantasy? How do you work, and how do those romantic elements potentially change depending on the fantastical world? How do you make it believable in that culture?
I do think that sometimes things like magic systems, sometimes things like limitations. So like a lot of shifter romances will have things where people are like either what's the word, fated to each other. Yeah, they have fated romances. They'll have like in shifter romances in particular, like if they'll do that. It's almost like a sex pollen thing we do in fan fiction, where it's like someone goes into heat and they have to like deal with
Fated mates.
It can. There you go. Exactly. And so like those elements, I think, are what really is very cool about Romantasy, is that it allows situations where usually us as people, if I wanted to go out and date someone, it's just a free will decision for me to date. And if I don't want to date them, I stop doing that. And in fantasy, often you can come up with these really fun concepts in which it forces the character to kind of have a confrontation about how they feel about something, whether they want to admit to it or not. And that's how I think that fantasy affects the way that the romance forms, is that a lot of the times, especially in Romantasy, you'll always have this element of one of the partners is really resisting it, especially if they fall in love with a douche. Even if they're not really a douche, they're just being like, my go-to is Kate and Curran from the Kate Daniels books by Alondra Andrews. And that one is just, it is literally Curran dragging this woman behind him of like,
here, kitty,
you're
kitty.
in love with me.
Here, kitty,
you
kitty.
know you're in love with me. You're gonna be with me. Now, not in a gross coercion way.
No. They know.
Every second of that romance, even though she knows she is so into Curran, it's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think is how those two things affect each other, is that often what we in the normal world can step away from a relationship, God bless you, if you're able to do that. And fantasy, often you can construct things in which they have to address how they feel towards another person, whether that is like in denial in addressing it, or actually like stopping the whole story and being like, okay, yes, I do actually like you, even though you're a dumpster fire. So, okay, hopefully that answered the question.
All right, Melissa, you're going to have to follow that one. So, how do you describe your fantasy dumpster fire romance?
So I think this is one of those areas where this is where your world building comes into play, right? Like, what are those societal expectations? If you are say you're a young female main character, right? Whether you're a teenager or young 20s, what are the expectations for that character? Are you supposed to get married and pop out kids? Are we talking that kind of fantasy society? Are we talking something more similar to what we have here? Is it more of like an urban fantasy environment? So step one, figure out what the expectations are, at least for me. But I think part of the fun about Romantasy, or just a romance in general, is that there's certain elements, there's certain tropes that are expected, and that it doesn't matter if it's a Romantasy or an urban fantasy or a science fiction or space opera. People are people, and those tropes are what people, readers love. Like me personally, enemies to lovers all day long. I love that reluctant, oh my God, him, crap, him. I love that part so much. So yeah, I think that while the world that you're working in absolutely is going to influence how you build that romance and what those expectations are, getting to pick and choose which tropes and which elements you want to pull in is part of the fun of blending it.
Jamie?
Of course, if you add to my esteemed colleagues, who are all correct, I would also add this. One thing I particularly like playing with, kind of what a part of the show, what I intimated before my last answer, is the whole deal of it's getting to use the fantastical elements directly. Like, it's a fantasy world. They often have a variety of intelligent sentient species with exotic cultures and exotic biologies and compatibilities, and how they each approach emotion and love. And then, in religion, something that affects the real world in sense of romance, but in a fantasy world, often religion's like real, like the gods are there and they do stuff, so you kind of have to listen and factor in religion. The book, this is like the luckiest time panel, because by coincidence, my debut Romantasy came out today.
Hey,
Congratulations.
happy book birthday.
Thank you.
Yay.
It's film noir mixed with Romantasy, but there, the gods that the various characters worship, because these gods are real, and the divine has a hand in the world, like that shapes a lot of how they're approaching their romantic trajectories, in addition to like different species and things like that. So it's getting in addition to the tropes, and getting to use these fantastical elements as a lever to move characters together. Just sometimes it just adds spice to the interactions they have. It's just intrinsically by what they are in that world.
Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key right there, is how does the world affect, or the fact that they're either a shapeshifter, they're a vampire, or whatever. I mean, this societal world that we've created with all these new elements, how does that affect a romance? I mean, we all have our romantic, in real life, but in the fantasy world, suddenly it's like amped up to like the nth degree, because you're dealing with a whole bunch of different factors that we would have never had to face truly in our real world. I mean, I could say Clay is a werewolf, but really, he may act like
that.
one.
We would absolutely believe that.
You would believe it, but the stakes aren't there. Their stakes are high in your books, and that's the beauty of it. That's the whole aspect of playing in this fantasy world, is how does a normal relationship even come about when you're faced with some of these concepts and these new societies and these new relationships. And to me, that's the fun of putting a romantic element or a romantic story into a situation where you've got a vampire empire running rampant and killing people, and you wind up falling for the vampire himself. And I'm like, God damn it. Yeah, how does that change her perspective on everything? There's a whole world, going to war, and she falls in love with the thing that they're fighting. So it's these little elements. And I love when it's even just quiet elements. You have, I think, one of my favorite new romantasies is the Legends and Lattes series. And I'm trying to remember, is it Travis?
Travis Baltree.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's so quiet. It's such an easy thing, but everything is part of that world. I mean, you really truly believe there's an orc trying to figure out how to run a coffee cafe and trying to convince the world this coffee's good, but it's made by gnomes that no one else knows what it is, and she's trying to make this whole situation work, and yet she falls in love with the bartender, and it's beautiful. And I could sit there and I just let out a sigh. And all those elements, I truly believe that they were in Stormwind somewhere, in Warcraft or wherever, starting to try to do this little cafe, and it was amazing. It was like all these relationships, she's got a rat for a chef, and all these little elements, like how do you convince the people that a rat's okay in the kitchen? He makes great stuff. So it's all these small little elements that have to creep in and have to affect the romance. So that's the beauty of putting it in a fantasy world, is that it turns your romance up on its ear, and you really have to kind of pay attention to what the reality of that would be if it was happening,
So we've kind of danced around this a little bit, and this is one of those things I've not brought up in a while. And I always find really kind of curious, because again, especially when you're dealing with romantasy, right? We're dealing with fantastical worlds, fantastical creatures. How do you deal with romance when it's not just two straight up plain old human beings? So Melissa, how do you go about the interspecies of love?
Well, I don't know that I've actually written that yet, but now I want to. Actually, probably the closest was the urban fantasy ad come out in September. One is like a half angel, half demon hybrid situation. The other one's very much a werewolf, and that was so much fun to play with. So we'll go with that as being counted. So I think part of the
fur and feathers. That's the first thought that came to mind, is fur and feathers.
Right? I mean, she has wings sometimes when the magic's up. So one thing I really like about that is getting to play around with the different cultures, right? Like in the urban fantasy I wrote, they're both human. They just have magical talents that express themselves in that way. So it's not really a cultural thing so much as he's a total jerk, just really hot kind of thing. But if you're talking about, no kidding, like a werewolf that has a legit werewolf society mixed with a human or a vampire or an actual angel, then you're going to have some serious issues that you can play with that makes it a little bit more real and a little bit more, add some depth to it, right? Like with Kate Daniels, the Lona Andrews series, one of my all-time favorites. I have them all. Food is a huge part of like the shifter culture, like the rules they've created for themselves. So when he gives her soup, that means something, and he's just laughing his butt off because
that was the best scene. I love that scene. I just remember I read the line and threw my head back and cackled out loud.
Right? That is
sticks with you.
That is the best because it's like she had no idea it meant anything. And then Aunt B is like, he fed you? Like handed it to you. Like, so when you can play with those little cultural aspects where something means something to one but not the other, it could be a funny situation like that, or it could be a deeply serious situation. And it depends on the story that you want to tell and, quite frankly, what kind of characters you've created. Are they the kind that's going to prank the other, or are they the kind that's going to be that almost cozy golden retriever type male main character? So lots of fun to play with there.
Shifter into a golden or into a lab, right? All right, Jamie. So how do you go about when it's creatures of another feature?
Well, it's one of the fun things actually to do with this kind of thing. I think it's one of the things that you have to think about sometimes think about the most, because there's a lot of things. I mean, obviously you've got to start with biological compatibility, but that also then leads to you have to think about the very nature of the relationship. Is this one where physical intimacy is important? Is this one that's purely on a level of like emotional intimacy? Like, are we getting sexual or are we just getting romantic? There's a lot of things to think about. And of course, as Melissa said, the cultural aspects can be just as abundant as the physical ones, but I think it's remiss to forget to ignore the physicality when it gets to especially when they're radically different species. And if they're not even, in some cases, would be technically defined as a living creature, something like, I mean, to bring it into the world of sci-fi, but with the fantastical would be like a golem, a sentient, non-organic creature. You could fall in love with that. So if you could fall in love with a robot in sci-fi, but then it creates another level of thought of, thinking about both the cultural implications and the romantic and sexual and levels of intimacy, because romance is all about intimacy. So it's tackling the ups and downs of that intimacy when dealing with these sometimes radically different species.
Susan?
Yeah, I mean, the minute you said that, there was a book that I came across that was a spider and a woman romance and a human romance. I'm like, how would that possibly? And of course, I had to read it to find out, because that's what drew me in. I'm like, okay, now I've got to see where this is going, and it was fine. They did a great job with that romantic element that I wasn't expecting at all, because I hate spiders. And I was like, there's no way this is going to be good. And yet I was like, all right, that was kind of sexy. Okay, that was fine. So, I mean, those kind of new tables to play on is so fascinating, to kind of mix up things that you just wouldn't really expect sometimes. And I know a lot of it is out there, and I'm probably barely scratched the surface, because I'm old and I'm the normal road. But then again, I just created a dryad, and they are one of the most fascinating entities I have ever created, and I can't wait to see where their relationship goes, because that is something that is just so unique to me. Like, all right, they're a tree. Where could that go? And I'm totally in for it. And I can't wait to write that one. That's, probably third book down the road. But my brain's already going there. My brain's already rapidly considering, like, how does that work? How would they, they can shapeshift, sure, but at the end of the day, they're a tree. And that's where my, it's going to be fun. And that's the reason we do this is, those kind of elements are fantastic. I mean, it doesn't even have to be biological. It could be, like with Vampire Empire, it was a whole war zone. I mean, the vampires were a whole species that rose up and took the country, and now the humans are fighting back, and now you've got whole politics, regardless of whether they could actually do anything. Turns out, that they can, but what were the implications of that? All right, my God, this is going to start the war again. Is this going to save the species? Who knows? And those kind of elements, like when you're dealing with like Sarah J. Maas and the whole Fae society. I mean, they all have implications to what's going to be going on in your world. So playing with all of that in the terms of the culture, the Fae culture, the vampire culture, everything is vitally important to play with. That's why you're kind of doing it, and yet still make it hot.
Yeah, we'll just keep your dryads out of the poison ivy.
Oh no, that's fun. There's a whole thing going on there.
Kyoko?
So one of the things out of the things that I have published so far, the one I want to talk about is actually a short story that I've done with Milton J. Davis's anthology that's called Terminus. And so in Terminus, he let me have this opportunity to write Dracula with the daughter of the Wolfman. So in their universe, it's like modern day, and she's taken him to the vortex. So he's not been to Atlanta that many times, so he's come through. And she's entertaining him for a night because he's bored and he's, thousands of years old, wants to see what the night culture is like. And the stuff that I found and I've written now 3 stories in that same continuity. So they take place about like a year apart for each one. And the first one is about them going to the vortex. The second one is about them. She's out in the woods and she accidentally picks up a hunter who's coming after her at the same time that Dracula came to visit her. And so they both have to kind of fight the guy off. And then in the third one, this one's not out yet, but I'll preview it just because I'm so excited. It was fun to write. She takes him to a murder mystery dinner.
Oh,
She takes Dracula to a murder mystery dinner.
Awesome.
And it's Halloween themed, and it's like based on House on Haunted Hill.
Oh, better.
Right. It was so fun. It was so much fun to write. And what I noticed as I write that couple is that them both being shifters, because again, so in this one, Dracula is a full-on shapeshifter like he is. It depends on which one people like the continuity from. I kind of use the Alucard continuity from the Hellsing anime and manga because I love Hellsing. And so he is able to shapeshift. He can change his appearance at any time. He can just like grow into these crazy, like extra dimensional weird shapes and things like that. And so you decided to use that in the actual romance of building it up because it is a very unusual pairing between the two of them because he's best friends with her parents. Now she's a grown woman, obviously not a teenager or anything like that, because it would be way creepy if it wasn't. And so they have this very interesting dynamic where they're both kind of like, uh-oh, there's kind of this threat of attraction going on here, and you're, best friends with my parents. They're gonna freak out if they find out about it. And I noticed that having them both able to like fight is something that I decided to put in basically all 3 of them. I really wanted the romance to kind of have this interplay of like what we like about werewolves is like that interplay of sex and violence of like, ooh, there are some very scary things about werewolves that we fear, but also they have a great amount of appeal. And I think that really is what affected the way I write that relationship, is that knowing that both of them are incredibly capable fighters, but at the same time, they're also like kind of cautiously recognizing that they see something in one another that they really enjoy and that they want to spend time together, and they have to reconcile how complicated that is when, like I said, he's, hundreds and hundreds of years old. Now she's going to live a very long time. In this continuity, the werewolves live as long as vampires do. So like hundreds and hundreds of years. So it won't be unusual as she gets older, but that I like that play of like I said, things that are considered taboo versus things that are considered more conventional for a romance and for a fantasy. And so I kind of like to play in that area, if that makes sense.
So, Jamie, I'm gonna come back around to you on this one because here's the other side of it, right? We still have to wrap the fantasy story, whether it's an adventure, mystery, whatever else. So, how do you go about, taking in the complexity of the greater story, the romance, the fantastical elements to pull together that really tight story? Because there's still, you still have to look. How do you approach the whole piece? Because again, introducing romance introduces a lot of potential additional complications you wouldn't necessarily have in an adventure if it was just friends, right? So how do you go about packaging the complete story from that romantasy aspect?
Well, I think it ultimately comes down to integration. Integration. So we often think a lot of times it's easy to fall into the trap when you're writing of like separating out pieces. Like, all right, here's my core through line. Here is subplot A, B, and yes, and then you can start tying them together at places, right? I think when you're doing romance, you kind of have to have these two plot lines, your romance and your core like fantasy plot line, are interwoven from the start. You can't think of one apart from the other. They have to, they're integrally tied together. So you kind of have to do like parallel construction as opposed to cutting it apart into bits and pieces to tackle it, which can be complicated, I will say. Like, Songs and Sorcery, it is a mystery in addition, fantasy mystery, romance, integrally tied. And in that one I took what would probably be an easy approach, which is our the romance is tied in with the detective and the suspects. So the two plots move intertwined as there are suspects and others involved in the case that are part of the romance as well as part of the core through line plot. I think another good way to do it is something like, for instance, in a classic, let's do a prototypical, Save the Kingdom plot. Well, you make sure the romance is between, the princess or the queen and the knight, let's say, or whoever the heroine is. Sorry, I generally only think in lesbian terms, so I just only think about women. I'm sorry. So I'm not, but. So basically, yes. So there you want to create an intertwinement from the beginning so that you're not forced to create this sort of I have to jam together the Lego pieces at the end. You build the pieces interlocking so that it makes a harmonious flow as opposed to two conflicting subplots that are hard to integrate.
Susan?
I mean, the plot is just as critical to me as the characters. So when you're working to move the plot along, the characters have to sort of be that catalyst, or what they're interacting with is going to keep leading them down. So it has to be kind of interwoven. Like Jamie said, it's incredibly important that they move. They're not just moving from bedroom to bedroom to bedroom or kiss to kiss to kiss. It has to be come organically. And the story, when I'm writing the plot, but the characters are inhabiting that and moving the plot along at key moments, whether they're finding a clue, whether they're talking to a new suspect, or the vampires just attacked and they have to address those issues and what it means to them as lovers. And those kind of conversations, those kind of meaningful moments are the beat of the story, and those kind of moments have to be there. And the romance is going to play into part with that, because that's what's driving these characters along, whether they're turning from friends to from enemies to friends, or whether they're an empress and her vampire lover. It doesn't make a difference. So, those plots are incredibly important, and you've got to be able to thread them together, but they also need those moments where your characters reflect upon those things and, uh, discuss why their relationship is in what effect it's going to have on the plot and on themselves as well. So to me, that kind of integration, that kind of blending is constantly something that's needed in order for those plots to really gel and for that heat to kind of build for those characters.
Kyoko?
I think about it in terms of like, where is the character, and it depends on the work itself, whether it's a standalone, a series, a trilogy, duology, that kind of thing. I think about it in terms of like, a lot of the times right out of the gate, I know where the character is going to start, how they develop, and where they're going to end up.
Yep.
And I think that is how you structure the romance itself and the effects of the romance. And then because like I said, to me, the knowing where I want them to end up. So I'll use my debut series, my paranormal romance series. And so the first book is and I'm just going to use the novels. I'm not going to use the short story or the novella. And so in those three, I kind of knew automatically that the Black Parade was definitely going to be about Jordan discovering that she doesn't have to be this cantankerous, like antisocial, just absolutely, I don't want to talk to anybody, I don't want to do anything, I'm just a miser, I don't want to have relationships and care about people. And her falling in love with Michael and Michael falling in love with her has a really big effect on her realizing, oh, you know what, maybe it is safe every once in a while to have an emotional vulnerability with somebody. And so it's very uplifting, it's very hopeful, it's showing her that in spite of all, like, her trauma doesn't mean that she's unlovable. And that's kind of what that vibe is about in that first book for both of them. And then in the second book, it is where everything blows up in her face and it all goes to shit and is all wrong. It is very, very much about gray area, which is why the book is called She Who Fights Monsters. It's based on that Nietzsche quote. And so I knew that it was going to be about them having emotional turmoil after they get together and they're actually really happy. But there's always this added stress because there's just this sexy archdemon hanging out here waiting for her to slip up at any second. I mean, dude is like a snake. He is ready for her to mess up and he can swoop in there. And so I knew for the third one, it was really going to be about that really messed up gray area of like, okay, well, what do you do when you technically are in love with someone who is like 1000% evil, like irredeemably evil? There is good in him, but it's like, it's like a teaspoon of good. And so I knew that third one was going to be about the moral aspect of like, what do you do if you have a toxic relationship? And unfortunately, it kind of is awesome. Like she is getting stuff out of it, and so is he, and that's what the whole conflict is her trying to realize, oh God, I am getting something out of this. Where does that come from inside of me? Yeah. As a person? And so like, I think that is how you know where your plot is going to go, because if you know where your character is headed, then your plot is always going to facilitate how they get there. And so, like I said, I usually, when people ask me about it, I tell them that as long as you know where you're headed with them, whether that you do an arc, some characters are flat characters. They don't have to be, not every single villain has to be like a well-written, like sympathetic one. Sometimes you just need a bully. You need a one-dimensional bully and that's all your story needs. But if you know that out of the gate, it definitely helps with the harmony between balancing the romantic aspects and then the plot aspects.
Melissa?
All right, so romantasy. If you can take the romance out of it, then it's not a romantasy, right? It's a fantasy with a strong romantic subplot. Nothing wrong with that. I love it. If you can take the fantasy out of it, then all you have is a romance with the trappings of fantasy, right? It's kind of the same way with your characters. So if they don't have an integral part to play both with their relationship and the story, then it doesn't work. And probably the easiest way to make sure that they grow together and that both of them are a key plot point is give them both the same or at least complementary stakes. It can't just be your female main character has to save the kingdom, or your male main character has to, like, you know, rescue the princess or solve the case, or I don't know, fight off an invading alien armada, for an example. Like, you have to give them, like, if it's enemies to lovers, they could have completely opposite, you know, ends of that story. And it's just important that they both, when you're talking romance, one of your characters can't be one-dimensional. They both have to be fully fleshed out. They both have to have stakes. They both have to have a reason for not just being in the story. It can't just be because, well, she needs somebody hot that looks like Dean Winchester for reasons. It has to be because that they have a reason to be there too. It's kind of like when you're creating your bad guys. Your bad guys need to have a goal too. It can't just be for evil, though that's kind of fun too. They have to have another reason for it. So when you're talking romantasy, when you're talking a good romantic plot, they have to have, both of them have to have a good reason, whether it's because they're both partners that have been assigned, like, oh, I don't know, like, let's save the world and stop it from ending, and that's why we're forced proximity, or they're both mercenaries in the same company, or they're both, you know, one's assigned to protect the other, or they're, I don't know, magical beings that are attracted to each other. There has to be a reason that is connected to the plot for it to really hold up and all hang together.
Do we really have to stop the world from blowing up again? I mean,
we did it
Where my
last
stuff
Tuesday. It's kind of like having to make dinner every night. It seems like a lot.
yeah. And then, can it be somebody else's problem this week? So, you know, I mean, much like everything, we can spend a lot of time deconstructing and diving into things from a lot of different angles. But I want to give everybody a chance, because there's always those things that are important to us or that we don't necessarily get to. So, and Susan, I'm going to start with you on this one. But what's something we haven't talked about romantasy that you think we need to dive into a little bit?
I don't know. I've been thinking about, like, I don't mind the romantasy title, but to me, I mean, it's an easy way to attribute to anything. But I'm always afraid that it's going to just be here and gone, and I want to make sure that the genre stays, because it's been around for a long time. Before it was called romantasy, and it's going to be here even after the term romantasy departs. So how do we make, you know, for some reason people have been glommed onto the term romantasy, you know, when it, you know, whatever sparked it, whether it was Sarah J. Maas, who knows what sparked it. But I want to make sure that, you know, people believe in it all the time, rather than when we have a title. Because like steampunk, it came and went. There's plenty of those little subgenres that people just slap a label on to get more publicity, but then it's gone. And, you know, it kind of falls away. And I want to make sure romantasy stays. And that's on us as authors to try and make the genre be as accessible and as enjoyable as it has always been, and to let people know that it will always be here, and to find out, you know, look at the older stuff that has been out. Look at Patricia Reed. Look at Mercedes Lakey. I mean, there's so many that came before us and have really put a stamp on it, and we're taking it into new directions. And I want to make sure that we as authors and that the fans are going to stay with us even after this label falls away, that this genre persists, because I think it's an important genre. I think it has a huge following right now, and I want to make sure that that sticks around a little bit for us. So,
Kyoko?
I want to do a shout out to, I think Enemies to Lovers is very, very valid in romantasy, and that is what I wrote in my debut series. But I also want to make a little special mention of Friends to Lovers. I think when done right in romantasy, it is the dang cutest thing in the world. I have a very, very toxic and unhappy relationship with the Dresden Files right now. But I have to keep coming back to Harry and Murphy. I was just like, God, that is my shit. Like, that is where I live in Romantasy. I've been obsessed with them since 2015, and I will probably never get over it. But like, that is probably one of my favorite Romantasy couples ever, just because of it was such a slow build up to it, but like when it finally got there and Harry's dumbass finally noticed that he liked Murphy. I just love that it was such a light bulb moment. Like, he's so dumb that he didn't notice of like, oh yeah, this person I casually like, they do shit that only soulmates would do for each other, and then they just like hide it under this dumb label of like, we're just friends. No, what you just did is something that you would only do for someone you love, who means the world to you. That is not your best friend. You're in love with that person. But I think that Enemies to Lovers is definitely super, super cool. But I always have a soft spot for Romantasies where it's friends to lovers, because I love that. Like, there's usually like a really pivotal moment in which either one or both of the, or if it's a throuple, whichever person, or polyamory too. But I love the moment, the epiphany moment, the love epiphany moment, whenever they like put together of like, oh no, I'm in love with my best friend. What do I do about that? And so I will fall for that every single time. If you write that in your Romantasy, my dumbass will probably show up to watch it. So
I'm taking notes. How to get Kyoko to buy my book.
There you go. That is a very easy way to do it.
Oh, man.
Melissa?
Friends to Lovers. I love it. I love it so much. And I swear, you've read everything I've read, and I love this so much. You're my new best friend.
Awesome.
And now we formed a book club. It's all right.
Yes, we have.
Also,
I
shout
love
out for
it.
Patricia Briggs and Adam and Mercy. Oh my goodness, their relationship was just chef's kiss.
another
Love
one.
it. Yep. So, I think it's important to bring up with Romantasy that it's all the things, right? It's not just a romance. It's not just a fantasy. It's not just an adventure. It's like all the things. And I think my love for that probably started like as a kid when I watched The Princess Bride for the first time, because it has all of those elements. It's not just a boring kissing story. It has pirates and adventure and, giants and shrieking eels and all this cool stuff, and a evil prince and, miracles. So I love all of those elements. And to Susan's point of, even if that label of Romantasy falls away, that, the genre itself continues on. It's just one of those, like, if you can weave a story that has all of those elements in it, then Romantasy is not going to go anywhere.
Excellent.
All right, Jamie, you get the last word.
I think something important to keep in mind when it comes to Romantasy is to be bold. Do not let the strictest definition of fantasy define you, because fantasy is anything is anything fantastical. I think but Romantasy is an easy portmanteau, so there's nothing easy like romance sci-fi or romance whatever. But I think we can all be bold and include and take the lessons that we have learned from Romantasy and apply it to mixing heavy romance with various other genre fiction and create some real wondrous tales that don't already exist in this world.
I just realized, I was like, oh my god, the portmanteau should be ants.
Well, there's ants. There's ants on the field.
Well, before we put this book to bed, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, and of course, their Romantasy that they need to pick up as well. So, or anything else they need to stack into that to be read pile. So, Jamie, you're up first.
Yes, as I said, I'm Jamie Garner. I write as Jamie Garner, Amelia Quantrill, and Temple Heart. But fortunately, all of my literary minds can be found in one place, jbgarnerwrites.com. I'm also JB Garner Writes on most major websites, social media. I literally, as the day of this recording, released Songs and Ginger Blue Publishing, my esteemed publisher, released Songs and Sorcery. It is a film noir meets Romantasy. That is out today, start of a series. Then in February, I am February is Temple Heart. I'm debuting a superhero supervillain sapphic romance that is pretty much Romantasy with tights. called The Powers That Be. And so that's what I've got coming up. Buy them all, please.
Susan?
You can find me at clayandsusangriffith.com. We've got all our books there, excerpts, and where to find us. You can find me on Facebook, on Blue Sky, not on Twitter anymore, but I'm going to try and get on Instagram and TikTok. We'll see how that goes for my new book, The Monstrance, which is a 1930s magic mystery. So we will be working hopefully towards that getting out within this upcoming year.
Kyoko?
I am Kyoko M once again, and you can find all of my stuff at shewhowritesmonsters.com. As I mentioned, my first book with Falstaff, The Starlight Contingency, came out in October of this year. I would love you to buy a copy if you are interested in space opera and lots of F-bombs and aliens and explosions. I will have like I said, Captain America: The Shield of Sam Wilson will be out in February with Titan Books and Marvel Comics. And then I have at least 2 more anthologies I will be in with Milton J. Davis. The first one is going to be Space Funk, which is a science fiction anthology that features all African American and Black authors. And then the other one is going to be Terminus 3, which is where you'll see part 3 of the Werewolf and Dracula romance that I just mentioned. It will be featured in the upcoming Terminus 3 anthology coming out next year. So that is me.
Melissa?
Once again, I'm Melissa Olthoff. You can find me at melissaolthoff.net and obviously Facebook, where I spend way too much time. You can also find me on Instagram under Savage Bunny for Reasons, because that was my first series and it's the one I'm wrapping up right now. I am technically on Twitter, but mostly I just retweet everybody's stuff and I really don't know how to use it. And you can usually find me on Discord somewhere. I also don't know how to use that one. Social media is so much fun. As for Romantasy stuff, I just had Shadows May Fall come out. It is book 2 in the Hit World Valkyries series, and it is 100% enemies to lovers. The guy 100% looks like Dean Winchester for reasons. And if you like those epic stakes where you do kind of have to save the world, then that one might be a fun read for you. Yeah, I've got some other stuff coming up, but next year's going to be big. It's going to be a lot of fun. And I'm 100% picking up your book, Kyoko, because that sounds amazing.
Thank you.
Love it.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingprose.com, and of course, here at ConTinual. And we will see you guys again soon.